In the dense forests and winding rivers of mid-18th century North America, a fragile peace trembled on the edge of collapse. Here, vast empires staked their claims. France with its chain of distant outposts, Britain with its swelling colonies pressing ever westward. The land itself was a patchwork of alliances and rivalries, where Native American nations navigated shifting promises and encroachments. Tensions simmered as fur traders, settlers, and soldiers moved across disputed frontiers, each action a spark in dry underbrush. In this contested world, the ambitions of kings and the daily struggles of ordinary people converged, setting the stage for a conflict that would reshape continents. The French and Indian War, as it would come to be known, unfolded from these tangled roots, a contest not just for territory, but for the future of North America and for the destinies of the peoples who called it home. In the middle of the 18th century, the forests and rivers of North America hummed with uneasy tension. On the surface, the land appeared a patchwork of settlements and wilderness, but beneath, powerful forces were at work. Empires vying for dominion, native nations navigating shifting allegiances, and economic ambitions fueling a contest that would soon erupt into open war. The French and Indian War, as it came to be known in the American colonies, was the North American theater of a much larger conflict, the 7 Years' War, which would eventually draw in powers from across the globe. Yet its origins were distinctly rooted in the unique, contested landscape of North America. At the heart of the conflict stood two imperial giants, Britain and France, whose ambitions matched the vastness of the continent itself. By the 1750s, Britain's 13 colonies lined the Atlantic coast, their population swelling past 1 million. These colonists eyed the forests and fertile lands beyond the Appalachian Mountains, yearning for new farmland and economic opportunity. To their west and north, France claimed a sweeping arc of territory known as New France. This was no small holding. It stretched from the mouth of the Mississippi up through the Great Lakes and into Canada. Yet, despite its impressive size, New France was sparsely settled, with around 60,000 French inhabitants scattered in distant outposts and villages, many clustered along rivers that served as vital arteries for travel and trade. The border between these French and British realms was never precisely drawn. Instead, it shifted with each new settlement, trading post, and fort built in the forests. The upper Ohio River Valley became the epicenter of this ambiguity, a region rich in resources, crisscrossed with vital waterways, and coveted by both empires. Here, the land was more than a prize, it was a crossroads. The French, intent on protecting their lucrative fur trade and maintaining a corridor between their Canadian and Louisiana holdings, constructed a series of forts along the Ohio. These strongholds were more than military outposts. They were statements of intent meant to assert French presence and block British expansion into the heart of the continent. British colonists, for their part, were not content to remain hemmed in by the Appalachians. The promise of new land lured settlers westward, and colonial governments, especially that of Virginia, began to lay claims deep into the Ohio Territory. As tensions mounted, both sides recognized that the key to controlling this contested ground lay not just in forts and soldiers, but in alliances with the native nations who called these lands home. Native American nations had long been central to the continent's balance of power. The Iroquois Confederacy, a formidable league controlling much of upstate New York and northern Pennsylvania, wielded particular influence. For decades, the Iroquois had skillfully navigated the rivalries between the French and British, leveraging their position to secure trade goods and maintain autonomy. Other nations, such as the Shawnee and Delaware, also held sway in the Ohio Valley. These groups, with their own interests and grievances, found themselves courted by both empires, each promising trade, protection, or respect for territorial rights. The French, with their smaller colonial population, relied heavily on the strength of their alliances. Their fur trade network, stretching from the Great Lakes to the Mississippi, depended on cooperation with native trappers and traders. Over years of exchange, French traders and missionaries had forged relationships with many tribes, often learning their languages and adopting diplomatic customs. In the early stages of the conflict, these connections gave the French a distinct advantage, as native nations feared that British expansion would mean the loss of their lands and way of life. The British, by contrast, struggled to win native trust. Colonial expansion often came at the expense of indigenous lands, and settlers' hunger for territory bred resentment and suspicion. Still, British officials recognized the necessity of native alliances and made their own overtures, sometimes offering better trade terms or military support. The Iroquois, in particular, played a careful game, at times siding with the British, at others remaining neutral, always mindful of preserving their own power amid the gathering storm. The coming war was not the first clash between European empires on North American soil. Earlier in the century, a series of imperial conflicts, King William's War, Queen Anne's War, and King George's War, had swept across the colonies, leaving scars and grievances on both sides. These earlier wars had set precedents, settlements raided, alliances formed and broken, and territories exchanged in treaties that rarely reflected the realities on the ground. Each new conflict sowed seeds of mistrust and anticipation, making peace feel temporary and fragile. By the early 1750s, events in the Ohio Valley began to spiral toward war. French construction of forts, most notably Fort Duquesne, at the strategic forks of the Ohio where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers meet, was a bold move to solidify their claim. British colonial authorities responded with alarm. In 1753, Virginia's lieutenant governor sent a young officer, George Washington, on a diplomatic mission to Fort Le Boeuf, demanding that the French withdraw from the Ohio Valley. The French refused, and tensions simmered. The next year, the situation escalated further. In a dense thicket at a place called Jumonville Glen, Washington and his men encountered a French diplomatic party. Shots were fired, the first of the war, and the long simmering rivalry burst into open conflict. What began as an isolated skirmish quickly expanded, drawing in colonial militias, regular troops from both empires, and a host of native nations compelled to choose sides or navigate a perilous neutrality. For many native peoples, the war was not simply a contest between European powers, but a struggle for survival and autonomy. The Shawnee and Delaware, for example, found themselves squeezed between French promises and British encroachment. Some saw alliance with the French as the best hope for preserving their lands. Others sought to resist both empires or extract concessions from whichever side appeared stronger at any given moment. The Iroquois, too, continued their balancing act, striving to maintain influence as the balance tilted from one power to the other. The economic motivations driving both empires were clear. The rich, fur-bearing forests of the interior represented a source of immense wealth, fueling competition for trade routes and control over strategic locations. The French, with fewer settlers, relied on keeping these trade networks intact. The British, with their growing colonial population, sought endless opportunity in westward expansion land for farms, towns, and future generations. As fighting intensified, both empires redoubled their efforts to court native support. French envoys emphasized their long-standing trade relationships and the threat posed by British settlers. British officials, sometimes offering gifts or military aid, sought to counter French influence, though with mixed success. In the early years of the conflict, the French generally held the upper hand among native allies, their established relationships outweighing British promises. The contest for control extended beyond forts and battlefields. Waterways, the rivers and lakes that threaded through the wilderness, were the lifeblood of commerce and movement. The struggle for the forks of the Ohio, in particular, became symbolic of the larger conflict. Whoever controlled this junction controlled access to the interior, and by extension, the fate of the continent itself. While the immediate sparks of war flared in the Ohio Valley, the roots of the conflict ran deep. This was not merely a border dispute or a clash over a few isolated outposts. It was the culmination of decades of imperial rivalry, economic ambition, and shifting alliances, both among European powers and native nations. Each side believed its cause was just, and each was willing to fight for its vision of North America's future. As war erupted, the boundaries of the world itself seemed to shift. Colonists who had never ventured beyond the edge of settled land suddenly found themselves drawn into a struggle that would reshape the continent. Native nations faced agonizing choices, their destinies intertwined with the fortunes of empires that saw them as allies, obstacles, or pawns. Historians generally agree that the French and Indian War was a turning point, a moment when old patterns of rivalry gave way to a new, more expansive conflict. In the forests and valleys of North America, the ambitions of France and Britain collided, setting the stage for battles that would echo far beyond the continent's shores. The war that began with a skirmish in the Ohio Valley would soon sweep across the world, but its origins were rooted in the tangled, contested heart of the New World. Here, amid the rivers and forests, the fate of empires and of the peoples who lived between them would be decided. In the summer of 1754, as the forests of the Ohio River Valley rustled with the movement of armies and alliances, the first shots of the French and Indian War signaled that peaceful negotiation was now only a memory. The war's flames, once confined to this tangle of rivers and ancient woods, soon spread east and north, reaching the lakes and mountains of New York, the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, the forests of Canada, and the windswept coast of Nova Scotia. This conflict was defined not only by the clash of European empires, but also by the shifting decisions of native nations, each weighing their future in a world transformed by violence and ambition. The earliest British attempts to break the French hold on the interior quickly met with disaster. The name of George Washington, then little more than a young colonial officer, became forever linked to a defeat at Fort Necessity. As rain fell and mud deepened, Washington and his men found themselves surrounded by French forces and their native allies. The British surrendered, marking an inauspicious beginning to the war and setting the tone for the years that followed. In 1755, British resolve to expel the French from their strategic strongholds intensified. Under the command of General Edward Braddock, a seasoned officer recently arrived from England, an ambitious expedition set out to seize the formidable Fort Duquesne. The British columns, resplendent in their red coats, advanced through the American wilderness, unfamiliar, dense, and bristling with unseen threats. What followed became known as the Battle of the Wilderness, or Braddock's defeat. Outmaneuvered and ambushed by French soldiers and their indigenous allies, the British line collapsed in confusion. Smoke, musket fire, and cries echoed through the trees as Braddock fell mortally wounded. Survivors fled, the campaign in ruins, and the British appetite for swift victory was replaced with bitter caution. Yet not all was lost for the British that year. In the theater of war stretching along the Hudson River, Lake George, and Lake Champlain, a different story unfolded. At the Battle of Lake George, British and colonial troops under the leadership of William Johnson managed to repel a French assault. The engagement was fierce, with hand-to-hand combat and the thunder of cannon, but in the end, the British held their ground. Johnson's victory offered a glimmer of hope, and his reputation soared. He was celebrated as a hero, particularly for his ability to work alongside native warriors, whose knowledge of the land and tactics proved essential. The geography of the conflict forced both sides to become architects as much as soldiers. Across the contested frontiers, a network of forts sprang up, each carefully positioned to control rivers, lakes, or passes. The design of these fortifications bore the influence of the famed French engineer Vauban, though they were often adapted to the realities of North America, built from timber, earth, and local stone rather than the thick masonry of Europe. These forts became focal points of campaigns, with armies maneuvering to besiege or defend them, knowing that the fate of entire regions could hinge on a single stronghold. The war's theaters were vast and varied. In the Great Lakes region, supply lines snaked through waterways and forests, while in Nova Scotia and Canada, soldiers braced against harsh weather as much as enemy fire. Each region saw its own battles, but all were bound together by the same larger struggle for supremacy. After the initial flurry of campaigns, the French began to counterattack with determination. In 1756, they captured Fort Oswego on the shores of Lake Ontario, striking a blow to British ambitions in the west. The following year, they laid siege to Fort William Henry on the southern tip of Lake George. The defenders, cut off and outnumbered, eventually surrendered. What happened next became infamous. As the British marched out, some native allies of the French, angered by broken promises and eager for plunder, attacked the column, killing and capturing many. This episode, later dramatized in James Fenimore Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans, seared itself into the memory of the war, a symbol of both the brutality of frontier fighting and the volatility of alliances. Throughout these campaigns, the role of Indigenous allies was crucial and ever-changing. Native nations, including the Shawnee, Delaware, and Iroquois, weighed their alliances with care, sometimes joining the French, sometimes the British, and sometimes withdrawing altogether. Their warriors' skill in forest warfare, knowledge of the terrain, and ability to strike quickly made them invaluable allies and formidable foes. Raids on settlements and ambushes along roads and rivers became familiar features of the conflict, and the war's outcome often hinged on which side could secure the loyalty of key native nations. As the war dragged on, British fortunes seemed to sag under the weight of repeated failures and heavy losses. In 1758, a major assault on Fort Carillon, also known as Ticonderoga, ended in disaster, with British troops repulsed by a much smaller French garrison. The carnage was shocking, and morale plummeted. Yet this same year marked a dramatic transformation in British strategy. With William Pitt at the helm of policy in London, a new approach took shape. Pitt understood that to win in North America, Britain needed greater cooperation from the colonies. To this end, he offered subsidies and financial incentives, encouraging colonial governments to raise and equip more troops. The response was overwhelming. Colonial assemblies, now invested in British success, mobilized men and resources on a scale never before seen. With fresh resolve and better coordination, British campaigns began to find success. In the summer of 1758, British forces captured the fortress of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island, a key gateway to the St. Lawrence River. This victory opened the door to Canada, threatening the very heart of New France. Soon after, another British column under John Forbes finally succeeded where so many had failed. Advancing methodically through Pennsylvania, Forbes's troops approached the burnt ruins of Fort Duquesne. The French, unable to hold against the growing British force, destroyed the fort and retreated. The site was rebuilt and renamed Fort Pitt, a symbol of British ascendancy and a turning point in the war. Control of this crucial intersection of rivers shifted the balance in the Ohio Valley, cutting French lines of communication and supply. Meanwhile, in the west, British successes multiplied. A force led by Geoffrey Amherst captured Fort Frontenac at the eastern end of Lake Ontario, disrupting French supply routes and isolating their western forts. The tide had unmistakably turned. The final act of the war in North America played out in Canada, where the fate of empires hung in the balance. In 1759, British armies advanced on Quebec, the stronghold perched high above the St. Lawrence. The defenders, led by the skilled French general Louis de Montcalm, braced for siege. The British, commanded by James Wolfe, faced daunting odds: steep cliffs, fortified walls, and a determined garrison. But in a daring maneuver, Wolfe's men scaled the cliffs under cover of darkness and drew up on the Plains of Abraham. The ensuing battle, brief but ferocious, ended with both Wolfe and Montcalm mortally wounded. Quebec fell to the British, and the path to Montreal lay open. A year later, in 1760, British forces converged on Montreal from several directions. The French, outnumbered and cut off, surrendered. With the fall of Montreal, organized French resistance in North America collapsed, and the fighting on the continent largely ceased. News of these events traveled along the rivers and roads of the colonies and across the Atlantic, signaling the triumph of British arms. Yet for all the drama of sieges and battlefield heroics, the war's outcome was never determined solely by the maneuvers of armies. The decisions of native leaders such as Tanacharison and Pontiac, the shifting alliances, and the enduring toll of disease and privation shaped the fate of every campaign. The war's brutality was relentless. Approximately 3,000 British regulars died in battle or from wounds, while more than 10,000 perished from disease. Provincial troops and native allies suffered too, with over 11,000 dying from all causes. These numbers only hint at the suffering endured by soldiers, settlers, and native communities alike. Behind the headlines of victories and defeats, the war was recorded in the journals and diaries of participants. Their words capture the confusion of sudden attacks, the loneliness of sentry duty at remote outposts, and the hope that each campaign might bring an end to uncertainty. These voices, preserved in archives, offer glimpses of ordinary fears and extraordinary bravery, of men and women struggling to make sense of a world at war. While the North American campaigns drew to a close, the conflict's echoes continued to ring around the world. The French and Indian War was but one theater in a global struggle, with related battles unfolding in Europe, the Caribbean, India, and Africa. The treaties and negotiations that would eventually end hostilities would redraw the maps of continents and shape the lives of millions. In the dense forests and along the winding rivers of North America, the war had been fought with a mix of Old World tactics and New World improvisation. It was a war of sieges and set-piece battles, but also of ambushes, raids, and alliances forged and broken. The capture of forts, the shifting loyalties of native nations, and the arrival of new leaders and strategies all contributed to the war's changing fortunes. By the time the smoke cleared and the British flag flew over the last French outposts, the world in which the war had begun was gone. The French Empire in North America had crumbled. Native nations, once courted by both sides, now faced a future under a single expanding British power. And the colonists who had fought and bled alongside British regulars would soon begin to question what they had won and at what cost. The French and Indian War's major campaigns and turning points had not only shifted the balance of power on a continent, they had set in motion changes that would reverberate for generations. The battles fought in swamps, forests, and on the open plains were more than clashes of arms. They marked the beginning of a new era, filled with promise and peril for all who had called this contested land their home. With the signing of the Treaty of Paris on February 10, 1763, the map of North America was redrawn almost overnight. The war that had raged for nearly a decade ended not with a single dramatic moment on the battlefield, but with diplomats in distant European cities setting pen-to-paper signatures that shifted entire nations and peoples into new realities. The French, after years of struggle, ceded almost all their territory east of the Mississippi River to Great Britain, except for the tiny islands of St. Pierre and Miquelon. The vast territory of Louisiana was quietly transferred to Spain, an arrangement worked out between Bourbon monarchs. In return for the prized port of Havana, lost to the British during the wider conflict, Spain handed over Florida. North America became a patchwork dominated by the Union Jack, the fleur-de-lis pushed to the margins, and the Spanish flag extending over new western lands. For France, the loss marked the end of an era. Their colonial empire on the mainland of North America, painstakingly built over generations, was gone. The vast forests, trading posts, and river corridors that once linked Montreal to New Orleans now slipped from their grasp. In practical terms, the economic loss was less devastating than the blow to imperial prestige. New France had always been costly to maintain, its profits uneven, and its defense a constant challenge. Yet the image of France as a transatlantic power was tarnished, along with the dreams of those who had hoped for a French continent. Britain, on the other hand, emerged as the unchallenged imperial power in North America. The redrawing of borders and the acquisition of so much territory was a triumph, at least on the surface. For the first time, British influence stretched from the Atlantic to the Mississippi and from the icy reaches of Canada to the swamps of Florida. But victory brought with it a set of burdens and questions that would soon prove as difficult as any war. New lands meant new responsibilities, administrative, military, and financial. The true cost of empire was only beginning to be counted. Amid these imperial chess moves, Native American nations entered a new and unsettling chapter. Many tribes had allied with the French, drawn by a history of trade and relative autonomy. With the French presence now reduced to a handful of islands in distant Louisiana, native leaders found themselves confronting a British Empire that saw them less as partners and more as obstacles to be managed or removed. Previous treaties, painstakingly negotiated in council fires and formal ceremonies, were now disregarded or rewritten. The British, seeking to impose order, issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, a sweeping edict forbidding colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. In theory, this was meant to stabilize relations with native nations by creating a boundary between colonial lands and indigenous territories. In practice, it satisfied almost no one. Settlers, hungry for new land after years of war, bristled at the restriction, while native nations saw little guarantee that the line would be respected. The tension was palpable, a harbinger of further unrest. The British government's decision to maintain a standing army in North America after the war, another legacy of conquest, was met with suspicion and unease among the colonists. Garrisoning troops in peacetime, ostensibly to keep order and enforce the proclamation line, felt to many like an assertion of imperial authority rather than protection. The cost of this new military presence only added to the mounting bills from the war itself. Britain's national debt had soared to over £122 million, a staggering sum for the era. To pay for the defense and administration of its expanded empire, Parliament turned to the colonies. New taxes and trade regulations such as the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act were introduced with the expectation that colonists would help shoulder the imperial burden. Instead, these measures stirred resentment and protest, sowing the seeds of a much larger conflict to come. For the British colonists, the end of the French and Indian War was both a moment of celebration and the beginning of deepening frustration. On one hand, they had played a crucial role in the victory supplying troops and resources, fighting alongside regular soldiers and enduring hardship on the frontiers. On the other, they felt increasingly alienated by the policies imposed from London. The sense of unity that had emerged during the struggle against the French now gave way to questions about rights, representation, and the limits of imperial power. In town meetings and taverns, a new language of grievance began to take hold, and the identity of British colonial subjects started to shift. The war had forged a sense of shared experience among the colonists, and many began to imagine themselves as something distinct from the subjects of a distant king. Meanwhile, the consequences for native nations were immediate and devastating. The loss of French power upended the delicate balance of alliances and rivalries that had governed the continent. No longer could native leaders play one European power against another for their own advantage. The British, uninterested in the intricate diplomacy that had characterized the French approach, moved quickly to assert control over newly acquired lands. The result was a wave of displacement, the erosion of traditional territories, and the unraveling of social and economic systems that had endured for generations. The Royal Proclamation, while couched in the language of protection, did little to halt the tide of settlers pressing against the boundary. For many native communities, the aftermath of the war was a time of loss of land, autonomy, and cultural continuity. The discontent was not limited to words. In the very year the treaty was signed, Pontiac, an Odawa leader, organized a broad native resistance in the Great Lakes region. What became known as Pontiac's Rebellion was a direct response to British policies and encroachments. It laid bare the reality that the end of the war did not bring peace to all. The shifting balance of power in the interior sparked conflict after conflict, as native nations struggled to defend their rights and lives against the seemingly inexorable tide of British expansion. The legacy of the war for native peoples was one of profound and often tragic transformation, marked by displacement, the loss of traditional ways of life, and a growing sense of crisis. Even as imperial and indigenous worlds reeled from the war's consequences, the Treaty of Paris included clauses that would echo through the years. For the French Canadians, now subjects of the British Crown, the treaty offered provisions for the free exercise of the Roman Catholic religion. This was a recognition, however limited, of the complex cultural fabric of the former French colonies. In the cold waters off Newfoundland, French fishermen retained rights to fish and dry their catch on specified parts of the coast, a small but significant continuity for communities whose livelihoods depended on these traditional grounds. Such details, easily overlooked in the grand sweep of history, spoke to the ways in which the war's legacy touched lives far from the capitals of Europe or the battlefields of North America. Administering the new empire was a daunting challenge. The British suddenly found themselves responsible for vast and unfamiliar territories, populated by peoples with their own customs, languages, and expectations. From the forests of Canada to the bayous of Louisiana, officials struggled to impose order, collect taxes, and maintain security. The costs of governing such an expanse were enormous, and the means for doing so, whether by negotiation, force, or legal decree, were often hotly contested. In Parliament, debates raged over how to manage the debts and obligations of empire. In the colonies, every new act of authority was met with scrutiny and, increasingly, with resistance. The economic impact of the war was felt most acutely in Britain and its colonies. The staggering debt incurred in the pursuit of victory drove a wedge between London and its American subjects. The taxes and regulations that followed were seen by many colonists as unjust, imposed without the consent or representation they believed was their due. Protests erupted, pamphlets circulated, and a sense of shared grievance began to bind the colonies together. The war, which had once united Britons on both sides of the Atlantic against the common foe, now became the catalyst for new divisions. In the years following the Treaty of Paris, these tensions would only deepen, culminating in calls for independence and eventually, revolution. For France, the loss of its North American empire was absorbed with a measure of resignation. The maintenance of New France had been costly, and the returns often uncertain. The Caribbean islands retained by France, though small in area, were valuable for their sugar production and trade. Still, the sting of lost prestige was real, a reminder of shifting fortunes in the global struggle for empire. The shadow of defeat would linger in French political and military calculations for years to come, shaping responses to later conflicts in Europe and beyond. The reshaping of North America after the war also brought about changes in identity and self-understanding. Among British colonists, a new sense of American identity began to emerge, forged in the crucible of war and the challenges of its aftermath. The experience of fighting, suffering, and negotiating with both imperial authorities and native nations created bonds and divisions that would define communities for generations. The seeds of American independence planted in the soil of shared sacrifice and growing resentment were now beginning to sprout. The enduring impact of the French and Indian War is preserved in the records it left behind. Treaties, government documents, and the personal accounts of those who witnessed the upheavals offer invaluable insights into the hopes, fears, and ambitions of the era. Through these primary sources, it is possible to trace the contours of a world transformed, to hear the voices of those who struggled to make sense of changing realities. In the end, the French and Indian War was not merely a contest for territory or resources, but a turning point that reshaped the fabric of North American life. The boundaries it established, the grievances it sparked, and the legacies it left behind would reverberate for decades. The map that emerged from the Treaty of Paris was only the beginning. The struggles for land, autonomy, and identity that followed would define the continent's next chapter, one marked by revolution, displacement, and the continual negotiation of what it meant to belong to this new world.